Hello everyone. I'm here today concluding my 3 weeks at the new Masters Academy with a brief demo sculpture. I've been here shooting a film video series over the last 3 weeks that is an accumulation of basically my 20 years of teaching at the Florence Academy of Art. I was teaching a curriculum which I entitled Drawing in Space, and it has something that has evolved over the past 2 decades. It's a way in which I work, and shooting here over the last 3 weeks, it's been interesting to actually realize that actually no one's ever really seen me sculpt on film. So I think this is going to be an exciting video series for you to watch. And I also realized something very valuable as an educator, that demonstration wasn't something that I was always willing to do, or actually more than that had time to do while I was teaching. So that's one of the reasons people wouldn't actually see me sculpt. And I realized what a actually important teaching tool it is. I've left Florence last April, and now I've settled into Athens, Greece, where I've opened up now my own studio called the Athens Sculpture Atelier, where I still will continue to run workshops, and maybe I'll see you there someday. If you're in Athens or going to visit the islands, please come by, and I'd love to show you my studio. To tell you a little bit about one of the hesitations I had about trying to shoot a 2-hour sculpture is because I know as a sculptor, at least the way I work, that it's very hard to get a lot done in 2 hours. To me, it's a bit of a slow, methodical process. I had a former colleague who would refer to the sculpture student, the activity of sculpture is that we are the marathon runners of the art world. Everything we do takes a lot of time. Even when we finish a sculpture and then have to go turn it into bronze, or whatever materials you might be working with, takes a lot of time. So anyway, we're going to give it a shot. I'm going to work here for 2 hours, and I did do a little bit of a setup, which to me is some part of my teaching that becomes more and more crucial, and yet there's a little irony in it that I'd like to mention. I've set up a block-in, so if I'm going to do a portrait study, what I generally do is I'll find a model that I'd like to work with. I may take some simple measurements, because I don't try to over-measure or take a lot of measurements of my work. And based upon the position that I'm hoping to capture, I'll set up a block-in. What is a block-in? A block-in for me is, a departure point, a simplification, something for me to work off of. And you'll see that this block-in has already, through its profile, a center line that's tipping to represent the position of the model's head. It's representing here kind of these generic kind of rectangular shapes to represent, to me, one of the most important landmarks on the human head, which is the zygomat ridge. So to me, some of these inclusions, I don't have them placed properly, but I want them to be a visual guideline as I get started, and I may move them up or down. I do a lot of work that's quite planar. I set things up quite planar a lot because what I like to do is I like my clay to catch light and shadow, and that helps me visually interact and visually compare better. You'll be seeing me doing a lot of drawing on it. So drawing is also another way in which I try to make my sculptures active visually. Unfortunately, clay becomes, for a sculptor, one of your worst enemies. Not only does it not tell you what to do to it, so people don't have really an understanding of how to control it or how you should control it, compared to a pencil, but it's also quite dark. So value in your work becomes a big challenge sometimes, particularly if you get too close to the surface. You don't see shadow and light very descriptive. So a block-in for me, more than that, is it's basically a unit that's simplified in order for me to understand the general position that I'm going to work from or try to capture. But it's also a hesitation, and it's a hesitation in the idea that it's undersized. I'm a sculptor who works from inside to out. So there's a lot of hesitation in the sculpting that you'll also see in the Drawing in Space video, that I keep things kind of small and I like to pull them out as I discover them. There's many reasons for this. One of the main reasons for that is I'm not a sculptor who puts things up there and just gets it right. I'm someone who has to work on it and edit it and move things around. And what I like to do is I like to fight my battles underneath the surface. I don't want my eventual surface to show the struggle that I may have gone through to actually sculpt. And because a lot of this is undersized, that I'm able to kind of locate things, push them around, even begin to set them up, and once again, fight my battles kind of underneath my surface. I think sculpture in its finished form takes on the qualities that you've made it by, or how you've made it. And if you see a sculpture that even is kind of represented well or resolved fairly well, but all those battles that the person was fighting that are on the surface, there's still all this evidence of it. So anyway, I think sculpture can be a very hard discipline. It is a very hard discipline, but you know, there's a magical quality to making a hard discipline when they view your work that you made it look like it was easy. So anyway, we're going to get going here. I'm going to start by working off my model's profile, and that's a very purposeful thing. Actually, can you maybe look a little bit more right there? Yes, maybe a little bit more down. One of the major points of starting a portrait head through profile is because I'm wanting to establish it as the outermost point. Actually, you have to look maybe a little bit more over here, turning your head this direction. Yeah, exactly. One of the most important things for me about a profile and why I start working with it is because it is the outermost point of the head when you're looking through the side of the head. I use it as an establishment very early on in the sculpture because I want to discover spatial depth. I want to know how far back an eye is. I want to know how far back a mouth is. I want to know how far back the shape of the head is. And that's just not something you can see from the front. So the profile, once again, is my departure point. When I'm looking through it, I have simple goals. So when I sculpt, I don't try to do everything all at once. I try to keep things simple. So as I'm reading my model's profile, one of my first goals is actually to try to capture relative angles. So as I go through it and I start maybe at a chin, you know, I'm going to pull this out a bit. I'm really just reflecting on sort of the general direction that the angles that are coming through the profile have. I mean, it's not sticking there. When you're working with clay to represent a human body, there's three qualities that each piece of clay needs to have. One is gesture, so that's an angle. That's what I just mentioned. The other is its proportion. So every angle has its proportion. And inevitably, the last kind of quality is the character of your model's body, or in this case, the model's portrait, the model's head. What makes them look like them? So I think of three major qualities that each piece of clay needs to represent. Now, once again, in trying to make sure that that's going to occur into my sculpture and trying to achieve a sense of naturalness, I don't try to juggle them all at the same time. So that's why as I first go through the profile, once again, all I'm worried about is establishing angles. It's almost everything that I do when I'm sculpting, whether the blocking, if you know, that I talked about a couple minutes ago, was something that was something that was representing the position, the overall position of the human head. So the first thing that I was trying to do there was recognize the position of my models, of the sculpture's head.
So I have a question for you, Rob, on that. So you're
Shoot.
starting with the head in pose. I noticed some sculptors will kind of sculpt it from the front and then turn it. Do you have any thoughts?
Do you mean sculpt a model straight on and then turn it?
And then pose it with like a posable armature. So is there a reason you like to get it in pose right away, as opposed to like posing it after you've begun?
Sometimes it can be quite challenging studying model, but I think what occurs, a model's face in position, and you can go from extreme to straightforward, but the quality of their forms change. So I kind of always believe in studying sort of the eventual qualities that the sculpture should have. So sculpting a portrait head straightforward and then just tipping it into a different, you know, angle, I'm gonna be not seeing or working on or developing sort of the qualities that certain forms have, compressions or extensions that are occurring. Another thing, a little trick you're going to see me work with over a while, and this is a great question. I don't know how I realized this, but It was definitely not one of those unintentional moments, but I work a lot with a mirror. It's a common technique at the Florence Academy of Art. Painters use it as well. So it's, you know, something like this that I look down, you know, everything becomes flipped. It gives your eye an opportunity to rest and see things in a new direction. It gives you a new, interesting way to look at it. What I found when I'm working on a portrait head is if I'm looking at my model and I'm looking up in the mirror, I can turn up or down the mirror and I can straighten a model's head in the mirror. And I can do that with my sculpture. So if my sculpture is tipped like this, I can look at it and I turn it and now it's straight, which helps me if I'm trying to achieve a sense of symmetry with the bony structure of the head. It helps me see that straight on. So you can straighten your sculpture with a mirror. It's quite interesting. Maybe I should patent that, but it's, you know. One of the hardest things about portraiture, particularly with sculpture, is that, you know, it's, you know, and I know probably people are sitting out there going, well, I can make a sculpture in 2 hours. Well, I can't. So you're accumulating relative angles over periods of time. So, you know, if I got around to sculpting an eye on this sculpture, you know, maybe I could get there today in 2 hours, but you know, if I'm doing a portrait, I'm going to give myself probably, you know, at least 15 hours of model time. So for example, the eye's not going on there as a first consideration in the first day. And so what ends up taking place is you look at an eye 3 days later and you go, okay, I'm ready to kind of incorporate this into the sculpture, and the model's in a certain position that may not be quite related to what you started with. Then you make it accurate. And then all of a sudden your eye's accurate, you're feeling very happy that you've achieved that, and then all of a sudden your head is looking down, your eye's looking in the wrong direction, or this could be a nose, or this could be anything. So when you're looking at something over a period of time, the model's always generally adjusting their position, particularly in portraiture. A model, the door opens, the clock ticks, someone sneezes, the model's head's gonna move. Now it's your job as a sculptor to try to keep them in position, but once again, you can actually sculpt something that you're looking at a moment in time accurately, and it can still not function well for your sculpture. So that's one of the reasons that relative angles and me developing the position is something so important. So, you know, if I can come through this and get a good position, 3 days later, I can use it to reference what the model's doing to help them get back into position, or, you know, keep my, you know, zygomat looking down if, you know, I'm sculpting it many days later.
Yeah, so while you were shooting the course for drawing in space, one thing that I noticed that was interesting is how much care goes into the initial stages, and you actually seem to like loosen up and speed up as the process goes on. Is that because you're locking in, like once you're confident about where things are, you can get looser? Is that what's going on there?
Well, in sculpture, and probably a draftsman would say this and a painter would say this, there's nothing better than a good start. So some of the conditions that you're starting with, I don't think of them as being this removed from the finish. If you do your initial constructions well, whether it's with the figure or the portrait, it becomes an actual part of the finish of the sculpture. It should be if it functions well. So to me, yeah, starting well is quite important. I mean, I work hard at it, but you know, at the same time, you know, in all the methodical ways in which people can watch one sculpt, you know, no sculpture's ever done the same. Sometimes I think something might be quite achievable quite early on, and I'm coming up with all these problems in it and that I didn't expect, and it can get a little bit out of hand. So to me, sculpting, no matter how methodical drawing in space is, once again, is always a surprising thing. But that's what I enjoy about it. You know, I enjoy the unexpected. I enjoy it not being the same type of experience that happens to me over and over again. It keeps me interested in the subject.
I've noticed in your work that the poses and such that you use, there's a lot of variety there. It does seem like you're trying to challenge yourself with new situations.
I don't think of artists as product makers. I think of art as something that's hopefully going to be unique. And sometimes you have to really search for that. So when it comes to the overall angle, actually, Anna, I'd like you to look down a little bit more if you could. Yeah. One of the things in trying to accumulate on this profile multiple angles, so once again, I'm not really engaged in proportions. I'm not thinking about proportions. I'm thinking about the angles that are moving in and out of the profile. So if you're trying this at home, or you're attempting to start sculpting this, just talk to yourself about how many angles that you can find moving through the head. How many times does the profile change direction? But the most important angle is the overall relative position. So as I've sculpted my way up from the chin to the nose, now getting into the forehead, the most important thing for me is to keep track of how far the forehead is over the chin. And she's just...
Rob, I noticed that as you blocked in the features on the profile of the portrait, you started at the chin and worked your way up to the forehead. Is there a reason that you go that way?
Yes. Because the first piece of clay you put on the sculpture is always right. I'll actually can talk about how I read a profile. I read a profile, and what I would engage people in is that, you know, on the other side, well, on this side, you can see it too. I'm reading, let me turn this to the camera. I've set up a superciliary arch to try to find the mastoid, to try to locate the back of the jaw before we started filming this. And what I'm doing is I'm running down through the jawline and then I'm running up the profile. The way I teach drawing in space is I teach it as a redundant activity. I'm not trying to start a profile right now, make everything perfect, and then just move on. I think it's a big mistake for people who are learning sculpture to try to do that, or for that matter, even experienced sculptures. So what I do is I have a direction in which I'm reading things. So if I need to still keep working on this profile because it's not established well, I just keep reading through the back of the jaw, down through the edge of the jaw, up into my chin, up into my profile. So this becomes the direction I'm always reading my work. And if I'm moving through there and I'm finding a problem, I'm just staying on the profile. Once again, I don't place myself in any kind of hurry to get something done. So there is a point, the chin becomes kind of this definite point. When it comes to working off the human body, in other words, it's not a standalone portrait, the pit of the neck becomes a very important distinguishing guideline for your sculpture. The connection that leads out of the pit of the neck, the sternocleidomastoidus, runs to the mastoid, runs behind the ear, runs into the jaw moving into the front of the chin. So drawing in space in general, and on the video you'll see this, there's what I call the articulated highway. If I'm talking to you about how to read a sculpture here, which is just a portrait, there's that type of direction which is more demanding and more thorough throughout the whole human body. But these are very important landmarks like the pit of the neck. There's a lot of connections, whether it's the clavicles into the shoulders or the sternocleidomastoidus into the head that come off there. So here we don't have all of that, but
something that you talked about early to me was discovering things called anchor points and points of truth, and sort of keeping those throughout the sculpture. Could you talk about that at this point of the sculpture? What exactly would those be?
Well, it's another simple concept in that, you know, I mentioned, and it was taken as a little bit of a joke, but in some ways it's actually true. The first piece of clay you put on something is right, like the first drawn line on a piece of paper. It's going to be right. It's just all the other ones got to relate to it. And the same token, an anchor point, you got to work on actually, you know, not just making one thing function right. You got to work on having multiple things work well in your sculpture, whether that's the zygomat ridge, whether that's, you know, well, it could be all over, the pelvic points, the spinal column, because if you don't have a basis for something that is accurate in your sculpture, then you can't judge anything that's wrong. So if nothing's right in your sculpture, how do you make judgments? Because you can look at two things that don't look like they make sense to each other. So your clavicle could be too short and your deltoid could be too big, and you're going, okay, what's going on here? Two wrongs don't make a right. So the idea of having anchor points is having truth in your work. We call them structural truths, not anchor points, I refer to them as. Over these past 20 years, the curriculum at the Florence Academy of Art has evolved under my direction. One of my main goals throughout this course is to be able to give you the vocabulary and the mindset that I was instilling into students at the Florence Academy of Art. The first section that I'm going to introduce to you is going to be the concept of using the box and egg, which will reference the pelvis and the rib cage and the connection of the spinal column. The second section of Drawing in Space is about the rendering of the figure, how to introduce external contours, how to find and locate internal shapes of shadow and light that you're seeing on the figure. The last section of Drawing in Space is modeling, and that's how to resolve your figure. Like line contour or shape design, modeling is one of the things that bring out the expressiveness in a figure. The three major sections, they flow from one into the next, and this is how I work. I think of making a sculpture like learning a foreign language. No one has ever seen me sculpt before to the effect that you are about to. So I hope you enjoy it, and I hope it's educational. I think one important, I'm sorry, keep going.
Oh, that's okay. I was going to ask you what your first couple measurements were that you took.
I took the overall width of the zygomat, the two widest points out, and I actually, it would be hard to do if you measured me, the chin to the hairline. But my model here, Johanna, has a pretty distinct headline. And when I set up my block in, I don't get to the widths. I don't include them in it. And what I do for people that are sculpting portraiture, if I want to refer to them, what I'd recommend if you're going to be working with a portrait, I mark out these lengths on your board, because it's teaching for so long, going and sticking up calipers in your model's face or whatever all the time becomes quite annoying. So I think it's important for people if they take some measurements. The reason, if you're bringing in the idea of, it's almost, sculpting wouldn't be interesting to me if I had to sit here and measure everything. Then I would just not, I should go and do something else. I should sit in an office, you know, doing, you know, I don't know, accounting or something like that. So, you know, I like to explore things, and I like, once again, as I mentioned, the unexpected. I find also as a teaching tool that teaching people who measure start to convince themselves something is right. And what I mentioned earlier, this is how my initial workshops that I were doing, I called them the Alchemy of Sculpture, because the alchemy of clay to turn it into an useless object, to turn it into something special, includes this concept of getting this clay to gesturally, proportionally, and then with the character of your model come all together. You know, you can make a proportionate sculpture that doesn't look like your model, or have a good coherent position. And so that's the big thing that has been part of my teaching, is that certain people are good at certain things. So some people are good at gesture, some people are good at proportions, some people are good at getting the character of their model set up, but they may not be good at getting all three of them to work together. So in trying to teach people how to sculpt, you know, particularly when they're beginning, pace is so important. Like not trying to move too far beyond where they're going to get to, you know, just bury everything underneath surface. You know, students are going to learn through their mistakes. So I actually make people really seek into their work by not allowing them to measure. They have to work harder, meaning their brain has to function a little bit more. So if you don't give it to them, and the other problem, when you do give it to them, they get a proportion right, and then not everything else right, and they go, well, the proportion must be right, so, you know, they stop exploring. I think one of the things that I mentioned, the irony about trying to make something simple, as simple as a block-in, the reason that's ironic is because when you tell someone who's just starting to sculpt, can you look down a little bit? Make a simple block-in and then walk away, and you come back later and you're like, they don't understand what that means. So the irony of actually simplifying something is you have to know a lot about it. So, you know, if I say this is a simplification of a human head, here's a zygomat ridge, this is an abstraction, this is a Brancusi sculpture when you walked in. So, you know, a student doesn't understand this is my way to simplify a human head. And the reason I can simplify it is because I know a lot about it. So if you don't know a lot about, that's the irony of it. And that's what I find difficult. So when you tell someone to simplify and block in something, you come back an hour later and see all these different interpretations of that. So this is why I got really into this concept of block-in. But this is also, to answer your question, and also in a different way, why I don't allow them to measure, because the first thing a student needs to learn about sculpting is their subject, not its proportions only. So it's, I make them explore, and through that initial exploration that might be a little bit harder, they're going to come out with a stronger understanding of the subject. Because anyone who hasn't sculpted may have looked at a lot of nude models, they may have looked at, you know, whatever it may be growing up, you know, they've encountered, you know, a lot of people talking to them. They say, oh, I'm familiar with the human head because I talk to a lot of people. And this is a huge problem because you don't really know literally anything about the human head until you've sculpted it. Because it's a whole different thing, you know. All this stuff you get into, all this world in there. And I think, once again, it's the need for students in particular, just, you know, if their first part of their training is just to get to know your subject, don't give them any tools to allow them to do that in a simpler way. Yeah, so what you're seeing here, what you're seeing me do here now on film, because I can see I'm going to sit here and talk for 2 hours. I do like talking about this subject a lot. I moved away from the Florence Academy of Art, where I spent all my days talking about this, and now I'm alone in my studio in Athens with no one to talk to about sculpture. It's sometimes... I do miss the constant dialogue, though. So I appreciate all your questions and that you're here asking them, because I do enjoy it.
Speaking of which,
I have a question.
I do. Something that I struggled a lot when I was starting off, and also something that I noticed that the way you sculpt is you do smooth a little bit out as you go, just to kind of create the new profile, create the new lines. But what would you say to people who have that urge to want to smooth everything out and to make everything look pretty throughout the entire sculpture?
Don't do it.
Any good advice?
And if I see you do that again, I'm going to break your fingers. Finger modeling, to me that's like finger painting. You tell a serious oil painter, hey, it looks great, I don't want to use any brushes, I just want to use my finger and I'm going to just rub paint over and polish it together. The finger doesn't, there's not much control that you have over your work, actually. I almost put exclusively everything on with a tool. If I get more nuanced into this portrait, I'm going to use the tool more and more, and I'm over here on the other side, and you can look at the monitors and see what I'm doing, but I'm now drawing out a lot of shadow and light. So I've set up my initial profile. I'm spending more time talking than I'm sculpting at this point, so it's kind of hard to do both at the same time. And if I was chewing gum right now, it'd probably be also very difficult. But what was I saying? Smoothing out. Smoothing out. I think that, you know, this is it could be a really long question, or it could be a really long answer. I don't teach or demand of people an eventual resolution to their sculpture. I do think it's a personal thing. So I haven't taught people, say, okay, you've got to smooth this out, you've got to model forms to skin-like resolution. And I don't think that that's the only option. I like textures in my work. I like loose sort of setup in my work. You know, I like all kinds of different things. And so certain sculptures of mine do different things. But the reason I think that it occurs a lot is because when you put a student in front of a model for the first time and say, okay, we're going to sculpt this, they're not able to simplify it in that we're going to talk about a rib cage, and we're going to talk about a center line, we're going to talk about a pelvis, we're going to think about that as a box, and we're going to, you know, think about all these kind of techniques, and they're like, well, I'm just looking at skin. And so they don't get it, and they don't understand how to abstract sort of this thing that's skin and flesh and warm and different colors to them, and then that you give them something that has no value, and you're going, okay, you know, let's start. And I think the common thing is like, well, this is what I'm looking at, so this might as well be what I'm trying to do to it, which is make surface form. But the biggest problem of it, it's a neglect of what occurs underneath the body. That's the biggest problem of it. So if they don't get surface forms attached to units underneath it, then their sculptures are the bag of mashed potatoes. So I'm kind of exploring behind my profile. I'm setting up another sense of a block in here. I will say that, you know, this does not look like a beautiful young female like my model. It looks more like an alien, but all my sculptures as I begin them do kind of look like a newborn baby. I've kind of set up a kind of a condition that is the superciliary arch coming from the brow ridge to start locating the pocket of the eye. I've drawn out kind of a condition of where the cheek is, a little bit an idea where the nostril is. So I've set up my profile. I'm kind of exploring behind it right now. You know, I'm setting it up to set up well what is occurring behind it, but I do want them to feed back and forth with each other. So I don't think sculpting, you know, when someone could say, okay, drawing in spaces, you do this one thing, you get it right, and then you move forward and you get it right, and then you move forward and get the next thing right. It's not really like that. I work with it fluently. I just go back and forwards into different things. But Gabrielle, if what you were mentioning is the idea that you've seen me like sculptures of mine in process, and there's a stomach modeled on it, but there's no head on it yet, there's also a reason for that, if that's what you meant by I'm drawing a sort of sense of finish to certain things.
No, No, I was strictly talking because of my own students' sort of stubborn need to constantly be, like you said, sort of finger sculpting, and they don't seem to have a trust in the process to kind of let it just let the sculpture grow naturally.
Well, the best way to, if I'm giving you advice as a teacher, that costs extra, is you just got to shorten the assignments. Don't give them enough time. So when you say, I'm giving you 3 hours to do this, and this is the goal, they'll go, oh, okay, well, I can't, you know, I have to kind of focus on these other things. So to me, timing and teaching is the most important thing. The shortest project I was doing at the Florence Academy of Art was 3 days, and it would have been a setup of a portrait, but I found that every student, when you give them 3 days, is trying to finish a sculpture in 3 days, and that's not the point of the assignment. So you keep reducing it. My workshops now, they're quite nice. I'm enjoying teaching them because what I'm doing is I'm doing one-day poses. A student goes into a one-day pose, they don't have a great deal of expectation. When you say that the goal is to set up a coherent box and egg and then block in the legs to start to see the pose, they go, okay, that's what I think I can manage, so let me just do that. So I find that, once again, timing is, and what I find is that, you know, you do that in the first day of the first week of the workshop. The first day they get a box and egg up there and blocked in for legs. The second day they start to use it. The third day, and I found that in the fourth day of doing this repetitively, they're actually starting to get kind of a body type up there through use of contour edges. So I found that it was quite interesting, just this repetition in teaching. I never gave you and Florence a one-day pose, but I'm really enjoying giving them now.
So what you're working on now, is it kind of finding the higher points of the face?
The bony structures.
Bony structure, yeah.
The superciliary arch, you know, the ridge that comes over here, the pocket of the eye. My model here, Johanna, has very pronounced zygomat ridge. One of the things too about the idea of, like, you know, I'm sitting over there talking to you guys a lot. I'm going to show you something a little bit, because the profile line that I had drawn on there in the beginning gets covered up immediately, and then doesn't act for me as a way in which I can understand what position my model should be in or what position I've gone for here. I find these spatulas quite nice because we can do it. Then I have to kind of come over here. Can they see it?
You're actually like there. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, you know, this line, the profile line that I'm putting, it's not everything that you're seeing in profile is on it, but I'm really drawing a line through the center of the model's, or not the center chin to the center forehead. I use this line all the time, so when I cover it up, I want to keep putting it back in there. If it's not in there, I can't use it, and I find that a spatula, because once again, you can kind of come up with it, instead of commonly I would try to draw it with this, and then it kind of catches this edge and it's moving back and forth, and it becomes this line that, so this is a good way in which I find to help kind of control the line as I'm reintroducing it. Did I answer your question, or did I just start talking about something else? Okay, so ask it again if I didn't fully answer it.
Yeah, you did answer it.
Okay. I think that, you know, the major definitions of the head are often the superciliary arch, which is the pocket of the eye, and the zygomat. They're the defining sort of elements into the skull that I think, once again, are crucial visual landmarks. Another kind of, it's kind of strange to even say this, because, you know, anyone would associate a bony point as a very important visual landmark. And you just say it and it goes, yeah, of course, you know, bones don't change. You know, flesh moves according to how the bones are coming closer or farther away from each other. So it's the flesh that's always the variable in one sculpture. Bones don't grow or shrink over a period of time, so they become landmarks that are structural, that can be relied upon. But they also have to see them. So if you're actually a sculptor who's using visual observation to work, you know, there's a lot of bones in the human body we can't see, so I don't use them. Sometimes you'll get a model and you don't see a pelvic girdle, and then talking about the box and the egg becomes a little bit fruitless, because if it's going to be used as a visual landmark, they got to be able to see it as a visual landmark, or once again, it's not helpful. So I've talked to people about tan lines. You know, like, oh, okay, listen, we don't see any pelvis here, which is rare, but, you know, someone's been to the beach and we see the line of their bikini. I've had them draw that on their sculpture to even replace the concept of a bony structure in there. The only thing you have to do in those situations is keep encouraging the model to go to the beach, which is never really a hard thing. Probably not here in California either. So what I was going to say about, in reference to portraiture, the hairline. The hairline for me becomes this, it's one of the darkest, the value shift between many models, between the darkness of their hairline and the skin tone, is quite extreme. So when I come up my profile, you know, I'm coming down through the side of my head. I sometimes call the hairline a secondary profile. It doesn't have as much movement in it generally that the profile itself does, so it's usually a little bit more simplified. But it sets off the back of the cranium to the front of the face. And it's this very clear visual landmark. So I'd tell a student, you know, okay, let's make sure you include the hairline, and I come back and they got hair on the sculpture. I'm like, no, that's not what I meant. I mean, draw the hairline. I also use the eyebrow a lot.
Empower your creativity with the internet's leading subscription library for artists at NMA.art. No matter what your skill level, you can learn drawing, painting, sculpture, and much more with thousands of videos taught by master instructors. Our instructors are professional artists and best-selling authors, leading art education with over 40 books in print around the world. Our cutting-edge interactive learning format takes art instruction to a new level. Learn at your own pace, anytime, anywhere. Take advantage of our self-study assignments and beautiful references to practice your artistic skills. Our mission is to provide exceptional training to artists around the world at an affordable price. Thousands of artists just like you have used our library to take the first step into the art world, open new career possibilities, and improve their professional skills. NMA.art is the most comprehensive art training on the internet. Your subscription is everything you need to reach your artistic goals. Let us transform your art and unleash your creative potential. Start your free trial today at NMA.art.
One of the things that having been teaching drawing in space for 20 years, one of the hardest techniques I find that it takes people to get used to, and I realized this was so valuable in doing a demo. A lot of the conditions that we're working with in drawing in space is how to establish contour. Now the profile is a contour. I don't think I got too much room to work out, maybe a little bit in the forehead, but I think to notice how I put clay on to draw with, I usually put my thumb there at the bottom edge, and then I try to keep pulling clay up as if I'm drawing a line. So I think this is important, once again, as a technique to get used to, because it helps me establish a line. Now, in thinking about linear qualities, and you'll see a lot of this on the video because a lot of the rendering of the legs and arms and torso are developed through, outer, contour edges. And I work in this quite fluid manner. And there's many reasons for it that I think are quite valid for a sculptor. But once again, in talking to people about this, I find that well, I can't really get my clay to do that, and so let me just not even worry about it. Now let me put a form here instead, This is me just seeing how something goes, and when you're exploring a sculpture, and that's once again the thing I enjoy about it, I'm not trying to see it through to a finish yet, I'm just starting to try to see the setup. And developing linear qualities in your work, it gives you an opportunity. You're reading them on the model, and they're not on the sculpture yet. And until you get them on the sculpture to see how they function or work, you can't really make a judgment. It's all hypothetical, what's going to occur. And so this, to me, is a very simple way in which to kind of set up and draw an edge, and a very forgiving way. So when you overbuild, pulling back into it's quite easy. And this is the thing that I work with. I use drawing in space because I feel very free when I work. In other words, I move in, I move out, I don't worry about it, I don't worry about making mistakes, I'll pick them up, I'll catch them, but I keep my work quite flexible all the time. Now, when you just evolve form, which is the question Gabrielle had, you just got these forms up there and you're like, oh, my forehead's too big, I gotta pull it back. You're cutting back into your sculpture at that point, but then all of a sudden you got this flat edge there, which is just counter to the concept of sculpture, because there's no flat edges in a human body. It's this slowly moving topography that form is, or surface form. So I'm Once again, I think this is a very forgiving technique, but the reason I like to work with it so much, once again, is because I feel this sense of freedom. I can explore things. I don't worry about them. I don't worry about getting them wrong. And once again, it's a nice mindset for me to work with. So that's why I kind of wanted to show, once again, a little bit about how I evolve line. Now, not just to think about sculpture in terms of linear quality. Line, evidently, as students get more comfortable with developing them and they become more accurate, I replace this idea of talking about an external contour, and I refer to it, and once again in the video there will be a lot of this, is the peak of form. So a line is the peak of form, and when you've captured it, you've captured a passage of forms that are occurring in whatever area the body is as an outer border. So I begin to model, and in a 2-hour demo here, I'm not going to get into modeling this portrait head, but if on the video you'll see me how I set up linear qualities. I keep my sculpture like this because I can read my sculpture. I can judge if it works or if it doesn't work. When I start to determine a contour edge works, then I model form with it, knowing that that's the peak of form, feeling comfortable with where I placed it. And if I was to give you an example on, let's say for example this is right, and instead of a bony forehead, because there's some nuance to it, it's a thigh. What I do is I put clay here and model it away, thinking about the organic movement occurring behind this line. So here's an example. I'm not going to do much to this side of the head so I can do these kinds of things. Maybe the sculpture will be interesting. So I'm thinking if I'm looking at the contour edge and I've focused on it for a long time, that once again I'm turning form away from it. So the concept of drawing in space, once again, is how these things kind of function together. They're not separate as an activity.
Are you using like siding? I mean, are you using siding at all? I don't see you like siding, say, with a tool or anything like that, but is it just your like kind of visual language is built up enough where you don't need to do that, or do you not suggesting?
Am I using, did you say siding?
Sighting.
Sighting? What is
like
that?
Like sighting a line.
Sight sizing.
Sight sizing.
No.
Okay. Or an angle or something like that.
How am I judging proportions?
And I guess. And
I haven't even really asked myself about them yet. I had 2 proportions that I took from the beginning. So I would check things. So, okay, I've got the width of the zygomat marked on my board. So if I'm getting more involved in the front of the face, I'd be going to measure the width of my zygomat, and I've left myself like 3 millimeters on each side. I'll push those up or push those down. I'll need to locate them, but I know I'm going to add a little bit to them. I've got the measurement that was the space between the bottom of her chin and her forehead, which I've set up from the very beginning. Well, I also kept it low to build that into it. So I built the profile into there. I come back and I can take a measurement, and it seems to work out pretty well. There's still a lot of reasons in the discussion about measurement in sculpture. I mean, sculpture is 3-dimensional. Sight size is a better technique used for drawing and painting. You're just looking at, you know, that's this big from there, and I'm only dealing with one perspective of it. But there's a lot of illusions, and there's a lot of ways in which you can get a measurement feeling as though it's right, but it's still quite wrong. So if you measure the distance between a pelvic point and the bottom of a foot, the student has a measurement to establish that. But if you're looking at the side of a model and they put the legs straight up and down, but then you say to them later, oh, you missed the gesture, actually the stand leg's way back here. The distance between those 2 points now is longer. So that's the idea of like measuring. I measured the, you know, hairline to the bottom of the chin, but the ideal measurement for a human head is the top of the cranium. So often what people do is they put a book there and you measure from bottom chin up. And that would be the ideal length of a human head. Someone could say, oh, that's the 2 points you're supposed to measure, and measure across. And you know, if yours was too far back or too far forward, So if this point was too far forward, now I got to put it up here. And you go, oh, my measurement seems to have worked out. But why is the head up there? Because it doesn't look right. And then, I don't know, that to me is not a battle of a question. Like, it's just like, the other thing I found is that teaching so many people over the years is that when you talk to them about proportions, I know it's difficult. I know that as a teacher of this subject, I can walk into a classroom and look at what a student is doing and pick up proportional things that they've been working hard on and don't function well. And I go, oh, what do you think about this? And they go, oh my God, it's too long. I didn't even told them what was wrong with it. And their intuition leads them into understanding it's too long. And then they think, oh, but why didn't I get it right? And you say, well, the hardest thing I think for me to judge is my own work. So I say, I can come into your sculpture and see things immediately that you need to work on, but those same things in my own studio, a little bit harder. So that's when I say to people, I don't always think that, you know, professional sculptors have to teach professional sculptors. And I recommend it on video, you know, who knows what people have available to them that want to practice sculpture. You know, they might not have anybody with any amount of experience with them, and they need to ask a question. I think people's intuition, even if you're not an educated sculptor, can be quite strong. I would invite my neighbor over and say, geez, I don't think the head is really a good size for the body of the sculpture, which occurs. And I'd come in and I'd go, does that look right to you? And they go, I don't know, the head looks kind of big to me. I would trust them. Maybe. Unless it was Dimitri's. I don't trust that guy. Can you look down, please? One of the ways, too, it's really also hard to measure up the human head. Like, there's the overall measurement because it's from top to bottom. So it's kind of achievable, and that's why I measure the zygomat, because they're two bones straight across from each other. So if people do implore measuring, I usually recommend for them to try to find bony edges that are across from one another, or use comparative measuring between like pelvic point and patella, and then just use it to compare the other length of your leg. So there's some of that I might recommend, but there's a lot of measurements that are just really challenging. Like if I wanted to measure the chin to here, to where the lower eyelid is, just for example, it'd be a strange measurement to take, but the lower eyelid is off the center line, so it's kind of coming through here, it's up into here. It would be a really difficult measurement to take faithfully. So one way I try to break up, and I try to use comparative measuring. In other words, so if I've got an overall length, that doesn't mean that my spaces work amongst it. So I know that my forehead could be too long or short, my nose could be too long or short, this space between the chin and the nose could be too long or short. And once again, that would be a hard measurement with a caliper, just to take these measurements in here. So what I try to do is use a comparative measurement system. And the other thing too is it's a comparative measuring is something that one hears a lot about. It's something I used to walk into the studio and go, oh, just use comparative measurement. And the student wouldn't ask the question and I would leave. And then what they really want to know, what the hell does that mean? You know, what do you mean? Because comparative measurement doesn't work when you just look at the arm of your model and look at the arm of your sculpture. It's only a comparison from your model to your sculpture. Instead, how I like to use comparative measuring and how I like to introduce people to it is compare 3 things or 2 things on your model, and then compare the spaces that those are in your sculpture. So if I'm looking at a profile, I will judge the distance between the bottom of the chin and the bottom of the nose and maybe the brow ridge, then the brow ridge and the forehead, and go, which one's the longest, which one's the shortest, and which one's in the middle. So I use comparison more like a proportional comparative editing more as a ballpark, and go, well, geez, I got them all the same length, so I make some adjustments in there. But the other thing with measuring, I don't equate a good sculpture with it being in proportion. And one thing I like to do as a sculptor when I go to the museums, how proportions were manipulated. There's no precedent for making copies of human bodies in the history of art. It just occurs today. And if we really wanted to make copies of human bodies, we'd have to implore polychrome into it, and so on and so forth. So, you know, there's also a discussion in this, like, what is the place of accuracy in sculpture? I believe in teaching people how to make good sculpture, which doesn't necessarily mean how to make accurate sculpture. So it's the other reason I don't emphasize training through measurement. Accuracy, to me, is a teaching tool to help introduce people to a dialogue. In other words, if you don't use it as a student, the best way that I've found to train people is to teach people to rely on their intuition. And what they're lacking, if I say, why can I do this and my students can't, is the question I ask myself all the time. It's because I ask the right questions. I don't believe in training that you sharpen your eye. I can't stand that term, because you do not sharpen your eye while you're training. In the visual arts, you dull your eye, like a computer person would be sitting in front of a computer all day. It's going to weaken. If you're visually observing 7 hours a day and comparing and working hard at it, your eyes will weaken. So I don't believe in training of the sharpening of the eye. I believe in sharpening of the mind. And that leads to process. So the way in which to introduce people to have a stronger dialogue in their head while they're working is to teach them the questions that they don't know that are available to them yet. So when you go up to, for me, a beginning student and go, what do you think about your work? And they go, the nose is too long. And I go, but you're working on an ear. They don't know even how to ask the right question. So over a 3-year period when I was training sculptors in Florence, their inability to answer even a simple question on the first day, and they knew every day of a critique was going to start with me asking, how are you doing? They can tell me how their night was. They can tell me they had a bad morning, but they knew what that was going to lead to. They're going to self-critique their work always to begin. I needed to hear where they're at, where they think they're at. And that was where always a critique began. And I found when you do that, in the beginning they don't know where they are, so then you help them and you orient them, and then you give them questions to ask, and then you evolve their vocabulary. You involve their internal dialogue. When I was training third-year students, I didn't even have to critique them. So throughout a period of time, then you go to a third-year student and you go, tell me what you think. Well, I got to get more active in this, and my arm is too long, and this is going on here, and I think the gesture of my stand leg is not working out so well. And you're like, yeah, I'll be around if you have any more questions. So I believe in the inner dialogue. What do I work with that a student isn't working with, and is the discussion I have with my work? I'm not having much of a discussion with my work right now. I'm having a discussion with you guys, but that's okay, because that's why you're here. I like discussing things with you. So, you know, I don't know how much of this is, it's still camera one. I've been poking away at setting up a little bit more of a clearer structure through shadow and light. Still, it's like me blocking in, so the bony structure of the model's head. One thing, as I mentioned, that the reason I work with the profile is, for me, I want to judge depth with it. So if I've read myself through my profile and say, okay, well, I really don't know if there's problems in here I need to adjust, and that's, for me, good enough to get to a pretty good maybe, I just try to get rid of no's in my sculpture. No, that doesn't work. Okay, let me expand it, or let me get that edge in there. So I just work with no's. Yeses and maybes for me are good enough to keep moving forward. So I'm moving forward into setting up depth. Now what I do here is I know that I'm going to be putting eventually an eye in this eye pocket. So I'm beginning to establish the space. I know that I'm going to be needing to manipulate it, edit it, move it around. So I set up the pocket of the eye deeper than its eventual placement. So I start back here, and I'll place an eye in it when I feel that it's a good height in my head. And then as I start to explore an eye and start to get involved in where it's looking and the descriptions that are within the eye of how I need to manipulate those things, I start to move it forward. So even in a space like an eye, once again, I fight my battles deep, and as I'm pulling it out, I'm adjusting it to be more accurate. And then in the ideal world, which doesn't exist, then you just put that last piece of clay on it and it settles. Probably never done that, but that's the concept behind it. So if the zygomat, once again, I'm placing it here, it's deep in the head, but I use that to my advantage. Can you look up with the chin just a little bit? You're looking down a little too much. Thanks. No one's asked me yet why I work in a planar system.
Rob, why do you work in a planar system?
Well, it's unique to sculpture. It's ironic. Why I work with the planar system, and you're going to see this on the video, I almost exclusively make everything from the side and from the front of the head. If I'm going to look at other areas, it's actually going to be looking down on stuff. So I'll look down at how the circumference of a lip turns, or look up and see the circumferences of the zygomat ridge or whatever it may be. But this is a system in which, and you'll once again see it almost exclusively on video for the 3 weeks I was doing the figure, I'm looking at the front, side, and back planes of the model's rib cage and pelvis. And that's the irony of it, yet again, is to take away the foreshortening that exists in between me and my visual path to my model. Foreshortenings being one of the hardest things to judge. And I'm sure there's painters here in the crowd today. And when you say, draw that, Chapman, you ready for it? You got a piece of paper? You got 5 minutes. A painter knows that to draw the foreshortening of an arm coming forward to you, you don't even see people attempting it. It's the most challenging visually dynamic piece. So the irony of sculpting, I'm flattening everything, which helps me become familiar with not only my subject, but when they move, you know, I just kind of move with them. So in a model I'm working with is moving their arm in and out of pose, or for that matter, their rib cage, turning it this way or that way. I just keep following it, because the descriptions of things don't really change. Their position has changed, but it allows me once again to be sculpting with familiarity. Good question, Joshua. My model's smiling too much. That's usually a good thing, though. Don't be afraid. You can ask a question.
Rob, another question is, we've been talking a lot about sort of measurements and structure and, you know, the theoretical stuff about the process, but something that I really value about the way that something I learned from you that I would love to hear from you is how to physically handle clay. Like when you just talked about painters, and for example, there's a long time in learning how to paint that's just about learning how to handle oil paint, just learning how to use oil and learn the brushes and all that kind of stuff. How do you physically handle or deal with the clay as you work?
Well, in the beginning I put on with my hands. When I'm drawing edges and starting them, you saw me how I put them on with the finger. And when I'm incorporating line, I don't try to make it that complex for me. I didn't say this, but you know, okay, let's say, and that was the example, I tried to execute by placing clay here for the base of the top of the nose to the apex of the brow ridge to maybe the forms that are above the skull here. I break down line into origin, apex, and ending. So when I'm drawing a line, once again, I don't try to draw it as a perfect execution of a line. I try to set it up, breaking it down into an origin, apex, and ending. When I get more nuanced into a profile, which no longer means I can really use my hand, what I actually do a lot of, what I just started a little bit doing, I'm noticing some particular character things about the profile of my model, I start working a lot with pieces of clay. Yet again, this is something hard. I pull clay off a mass. This is about how much I need to think of what I'm ever going to execute, and I'm always purposeful with the amount of clay I'm working with. I kind of anchor my hand on my sculpture and I set things there. So if I felt, okay, that little sweep that's coming up into the nose, I need to add a little bit. And just for the sake of, I don't know how much it could come out right now, but once again, I'm putting these small sort of elements of clay up there. I like putting, if I'm getting into nuance of, in this case, which is a profile, but it's the linear passages of things, I like to keep them quite sharp and distinct, and that's something that a hand doesn't really do. So once again, this is me going, okay, this is how I'm kind of controlling more minute observations that I want to make about the model. And it gives it a nice edge, because it is an edge that I'm trying to capture. It's not a form yet. A little bit down. And the other thing that I literally for 2-3 weeks sculpted with this tool. I didn't really use another tool. This is my favorite tool, and I don't know what's going to happen to me when it breaks. There's a crack in it that it's had me very nervous for years. I made this tool. I don't think I'll ever be able to make another one. And I literally make all my sculptures with the same tool. But I just, you know, it's the thing, it feels so comfortable in your hand that it's.
You should just scan it.
I had someone try to make me one. And they copied it perfectly, and it still didn't feel like the same thing. It's like that comforter you've slept in for 20 years. You can go buy the same comforter, but I think that, you know, that question you asked, Gabrielle, is also a little bit more related to a question I get asked a lot. What is a talented student? Do you have talented students? I don't hope to only have talented students. I just want receptive students. But this kind of technique that I teach, I don't think about it as talent. I think about it as something you got to learn. It's like a language, you know. So it's you got to put your mind to learning. So when students come to the school, like, oh, I'm going to art school. I don't have to think. This is going to be great. And then on the first day, I'm asking them to critique their work for themselves. And they realize they're going to have to think a lot. But I think of a talented person, or you could say, okay, when is someone competently trained? You know, like when is, I think when their dialogue becomes thorough enough, they know what's available to them in front of them. Because I think we equate talent with people that just put things right on a piece of paper, or just like every piece of clay goes in the right spot, and I just never seen that happen. And so there's a lot of editing that has to occur in your work. Things need to move around, whether you're erasing it off of paper, whether you're, you know, turpentining it out of your painting. Stuff just doesn't go there in the right way. Or even if it was accurate, it just might have been a bad choice for the work, so you still want to get rid of it. So I just think you train a person to become aware of all the factors that are available to them that they can do with this material, and that it may take them a little bit longer or shorter compared to, you know, depending on who you are, but that's not being talented just because you can do it faster. So I just think it's like knowing the factors. Someone is a good draftsman, not just because they just make always good drawings, is because they push that drawing around and they know how to do that until it becomes good.
Yeah, Rob, it seems like there's a bit of a theme here, because you were talking about what makes the sculpture work. It's not just the proportion or just the anatomy or just the accuracy, things that people can obsess over, but it's how all these things, it's the relationship.
Yeah,
how they all interact. And the same thing with the study. It's not just one element, it's how you balance all of these out. It's like the overall, the emergent, you know, pattern that happens.
Yeah. Well, I have this funny thing about proportions, as you may have picked up. And it might have been a little bit about where I've been teaching for so long. I went to the Florence Academy of Art and was a sculptor joining a world-class painting institution. And I felt, well, geez, I got to get sculptors up to that level. And when I first got there, you know, I might as well have been saying, copy this. Because I felt, well, if they could, then our results are going to be, you know, interesting. And then I thought about, well, what does that really mean? What does copying a human being three-dimensionally mean? What is the achievement of it? What happens if someone does do it? You've just made a little person. And I said, well, wait a second here. If you just make a little person, what is that about? We probably learned a lot. We can probably look at it and be in awe. But I didn't think that that was the goal of things. But so I'd say to myself, okay, if I hired a model, I mean, there's a lot of conditions. When you work with a model, you know, this is this fantastic model I get to work with here. Thank you for finding such a good model, by the way.
She was local.
I need some more clay.
I think this ties into like a bigger conversation that's going on in representational art. Where does accuracy fit in? Where does
accuracy is
realism?
I just think it's a learning tool. Trying to be accurate allows you to question things at a basic level. Is it accurate or is it not accurate? Yes or no? Instead of, do we aesthetically like it? That's a hard question to answer for a beginner, and they're not ready to do that yet. So accuracy, once again, I think is a teaching tool because it helps teach the mind. I don't want to make her look like an alien. So
it's interesting you talk about making little people because none of the old masters, you know, the greatest artists, they're not doing that, right? Like,
no.
You know, Michelangelo's sculptures, they're invented, designed creations. They definitely don't, there's no one that looks like the Moses, you know?
No. Probably Moses did. Not Chapman's brother Moses, but the actual Moses. I had to think about it too, you know, because listen, I'm guilty of all of this. It's not that I have these opinions and I spent a lot of time trying to copy models. I did realize at a certain point, well, that's not really doing much. I think you got models there for you to use to make a sculpture. You don't make a sculpture from a model. So I just realized that it was hard, but I understood why I was doing it. I was doing it because I was working at this place where accuracy was this very important thing. And they were achieving their results by trying to be accurate. So I was trying to follow suit in sculpture and once again realized that it became a bit of a futile process. It became uninteresting for me to teach. If I just had to go critique your sculpture on accuracy as your knee needing to move up or down, once again, I would rather go sit at a desk and be an accountant at that point. So I believe that what was occurring here is you teach them initially for the purposes that accuracy for me allows a student to evolve this internal dialogue. It begins it with the basis that you can answer questions because you can't have an internal dialogue if you can't say yes or no or maybe. But you know, at the same time as well, it's like you get a model in the studio and like I was saying, it's like models are tricky. It's like you can find this great body type that you want to work with and they're in your studio and I work privately with models and there's like this horrible person and you're like, I don't want to spend my days with this person. What an unfortunate thing, you know? And then you find a model that is like pretty good for the sculpture because if you have this concept of a sculpture, sometimes models' body types will suit it. And then you go, oh, this person is really nice to work with, but they got really short legs. And the composition of my sculpture is an elongation, the composition I want to work in. Geez, so I found the right person that I want to spend hours and hours and hours and hours with privately in my studio, but their proportions really aren't suited for the sculpture. Why not just make their legs longer? I don't know. Just to make it accurate? So anyway, I've had a love-hate, it's a love-hate relationship, you know. Being accurate is not easy, and I know that, and I know it becomes this kind of initial achievement, and I remember the days when I started to look at, and it wasn't happening in sculpture, but my drawings started to look, instead of just like lines on paper, you could start to actually recognize the individual. And as a goal, as a young student, it's like it starts to really burn this passion in you that, wow, these things that I thought were unachievable start to become more manageable. And then, so I understand this need for being accurate, but it's not a means to an end. Once again, I don't think it needs to be a means to an end. I think it needs to be a discussion, and I think you need to see its relevant place. I've been frustrated at exhibitions of my own work when, you know, there was these very subtle messages I weave into the sculpture, or hoping people to involve themselves in a dialogue with, or come across, or pick up, and they go by and they go, oh my God, look at that hand. And you're like, well, the sculpture's not about the hand. And thank you for liking it. It took me 5 days to make it, but it was like, they all just were judging these parts that they felt looked good. And I was like, well, if everyone is just coming by and seeing my work and going, oh, nice fingernail and nice kneecap and nice this and nice that, I'm doing something really wrong here.
Yeah, I see an analogy too with how some people treat anatomy. Like we teach anatomy, I teach anatomy. And some people have sort of bought into this idea that the anatomy, if you just get all the anatomy right,
yeah,
it's going to be a good sculpture. And especially on the entertainment design side, I see that a lot. And I think the message of you, like it's how all of these elements come together. It's about the relationship, not those individual dimensions. I think that's a really good way to put it. And I think that that's something that hopefully people get. It's the relationships. It's not the one element.
Yeah. But I also think it's an interesting topic of conversation about this kind of sense of control that, oh, we're controlling our proportions to effectively compose better. And that, you know, you say, I manipulated the length of their legs by, on this sculpture, 4 millimeters, and that was going to raise that. This is like this total control execution over your work, but I also don't believe in that. You know, part of the sculpture is making itself somehow, even though I'm touching it. But, you know, I'm wondering about total conscious control over your work and how that, it's what I've been teaching about, but I think it's hard to be totally conscious over one's work.
And I'm sure as you're sculpting, you're listening to where the sculpture is going. You're like, what the sculpture is. You're responding to the sculpture as well, not just to the model.
This particular one, not as much as most, because I'm listening to you guys, but I have to make Johanna smile. My involvement in sculpture and teaching in my own studio has been really interesting. I always think about it. I don't think of it as like I've figured this out now and I'm going to work with it. It keeps changing. That's why I have to rewrite drawing in space. It was one thing 15 years ago. It's another thing today. And it'll probably be another something in 20 years. So yeah, I do think things should evolve. It's an interesting thing. I think that an artist needs to evolve. That's one big admirable thing for me, and why I love Michelangelo. When you see his first Pietà, his middle Pietà, and his last Pietà, they don't look like almost they're even made by the same person. He was always searching for something more, and I take due note of that. And I think great artists evolve over time. If they're not, they're just making a product. And maybe I'm doing that, you know, but I would like to think I'm not. I could have made marionettes forever after I made my first one. I just could have kept going on and on and on with the theme. And I might revisit it one day, but, you know.
Do you think that's bad advice? Because a lot of marketing, books and materials for artists, they tell you, you know, find your niche, the one thing you do, make that really clear, and just keep doing it. Do you think that's bad advice for artists to do that?
Say that again. I'm sorry.
Some of the marketing materials for artists, they say, like, you know, get known for one thing that you do,
yeah,
and then just sort of like brand
well,
it.
It would probably make your life easier. You know, I had to keep reminding myself I chose to be an artist, so if I think that things are tough, that not only have I been quite fortunate in the opportunities I've had and continue to have, but I became an artist. There's a little bit of an expectation of things that will occur along the way. But no, I think that, you know, I think that people will also say, you know, come up with this gimmick, you know, this gimmick thing that you're going to make, and that it's going to become your calling card, and, you know, the gallerists are going to be able to talk about this gimmicky thing that you do with your work. And then you're going to do it over and over again. And, you know, I hate to, yeah, I'm not going to even say names, but you're making products. I don't think the great artists that I admire were making products, nor do I think they were satisfied ever with what they were making. Isn't it true? Like, you make it, if you made the perfect thing once, why ever bother to try to make it again, actually?
Do you think that applies for art education too? Like, there's no easy answers kind of a thing, and if somebody's telling you, yeah, it's just step 1, step 2, step 3.
Well, everyone adapts to it in different ways, so everyone... I don't deliver drawing in space. There are these routines to it, but I don't deliver it to everyone the same way. I couldn't, because no one learns the same way. So, you know, an experienced teacher can come at you in different directions. So if you try to teach a concept, they're not getting it the regular way that you would explain it. And you've said it 5 times, and they still don't understand.
Set, but I can't do this.
Okay. Over these past 20 years, the curriculum at the Florence Academy of Art has evolved under my direction. One of my main goals throughout this course is to be able to give you the vocabulary and the mindset that I was instilling into students at the Florence Academy of Art. The first section that I'm going to introduce to you is going to be the concept of using the box and egg, which will reference the pelvis and the rib cage and the connection of the spinal column. The second section of drawing in space is about the rendering of the figure, how to introduce external contours, how to find and locate internal shapes of shadow and light that you're seeing on the figure. The last section of drawing in space is modeling, and that's how to resolve your figure. Like line contour or shape design, modeling is one of the things that bring out the expressiveness in a figure. The 3 major sections, they flow from one into the next, and this is how I work. I think of making a sculpture like learning a foreign language. No one has ever seen me sculpt before to the effect that you are about to. So I hope you enjoy it, and I hope it's educational. You want me to finish this? I'm talking a lot about art education and artists and this. I'm not talking a lot about making a portrait here. And I realized as I was talking, I was starting to make the front of the face from the side, which isn't really what I would be doing. When I get to the front of the face, my eventual goal is to get a good working shape to the face, the outer shape, not unlike getting the outer shape of the front profile. And a lot of drawing in space, and I think a lot of sculpture in general, whether a sculptor's aware of it or not, what they're trying to do, we're always trying to establish kind of big shapes. So the big shape of the human head would be the outer profile and then the outer front of the face. That's really the borders of your head. So when I'm at the front, you know, one of my goals that I'm working towards is trying to get to the shape of the face. But I can't simply do that by just sitting here and making the shape of the face. I need to work off my profile line, so I work in two different ways. I'll work off my profile line and start to set up a map and go, okay, what kind of space is existing between the profile and her tear duct? And try to get a sense of where the eye begins. And then try to go, okay, where does the eye seem to end in here? And then where's the zygomat? I don't have much clay on there right now for a width of a mouth, but it's quite suppressed as a width. But that's as well what I would be doing is going, okay, trying to draw my map, going, okay, is that, you know, the width of the mouth coming as I can judge it from center line out? You know, same with the nose. Now, once again, I'm sitting here trying to go, my goal is to eventually get a good shape to the head, but I need secondary information. So my primary information that I'm working towards to me is the shape of the head, but I'm including all of this other considerations while I'm sculpting. And I think it's an important concept. It's not in the first Drawing in Space book, but it will be in the second, this idea of what primary information is and how secondary information is helping you with it, but secondary information isn't the priority. Meaning it's not when I say to someone, well, use the edge of your mouth to help you with the shape of the head, or use the, you know, width of the nose to help you with the shape of the head. For me, I do that, I can just draw a line. If I can judge the width from here to here or from here to here. I don't need to necessarily sculpt it. So if a line doesn't help me see too much because maybe it's too of an abstract idea, I'd put maybe more nostril on there. But why this is secondary is I'm not trying to make a nostril right now, but I'm needing to use it to help me once again with my goal. And I think that's important because you talk about someone adapting to this process or learning about this process, and you tell them to start making a nose, they just go spend 5 hours and then make a nose. And you go, well, and there's no shape of the face there yet. So the minute you give someone that opportunity to, you know, sculpt something, they take it, and I think one of the biggest mistakes people make in sculpture is they're trying to do way too much too quickly. I chose the left profile to be the one that, the left side of the face. Another thing that's a question that probably is going to be asked, maybe even right now, what about the other profile? That's a question I get asked a lot.
You mean the other side of the head?
Yeah. Well, it's, yeah, that was my answer. The question would be to people, what about the other profile? And I say, well, there is only one. There's no other one. It's the same when you look on this side of the head and the same when you look on this side of the head. If I'm gotten this topography set up on the other side and I've gotten the eye pocket in the right place and all so on and so forth, and I've done that by judging most of my sculpture, once again, from profile, I'll turn my sculpture away from me. So I wouldn't be looking, I'd be looking at the profile, and I'll turn my sculpture away from me, and I'll begin just using symmetrical, idealized concepts to start incorporating more of a, developing the other side of the head along with it. Once again, a misuse of working by developing the profile and then, developing a half of a head and then trying to put another half on it. It'd be almost impossible. It's really more challenging, I think. You need the whole presence of the head there. So anyway, that's So if I was getting involved in the zygomat on one side, you know, once again, I'll wait and see. It's a bit of a strange concept. I do think that I do pride a little bit. I'm interested in natural qualities of models, so my sitters, so I do like to use them. And then working with these idealisms, also a little bit of a conflict because not everyone has these symmetrical principles. But I try to teach people to control symmetry, to not come up with haphazard asymmetry, I call it. So you can come up with an asymmetrical head that's based upon human error, meaning you just put things in the wrong spot. So once again, I try to evolve my head more on a symmetrical basis. When I start to see asymmetries that start to actually make the sitter look more like a sitter, I'll include them. But an asymmetry has to be based upon a truth too. So if, let's say the right side of this head, let's say it's accurate, that I could use it to judge the asymmetries that are existing on the other side. But I found that if you're unable to control symmetry in your work, just on a general level, and there will be human error associated with it, my worry is that I call it the sculpture that looks like the fish hook got caught in the mouth, in the corner of the mouth. So if you place, you know, a mouth, you know, farther back on one side, and then even maybe farther in, you know, you start making things do like that. When you push a zygomat too far back on one side, and maybe too far in, like your gaze of the head starts to look like it's turning in this direction. So haphazard asymmetries lead to all kinds of problems in the work. If you know that Leonardo painting that just sold for a couple bucks somewhere, it was big news, if you remember. Did you all pick up that this painting looked like it was looking off to the left? Go back and look at it. One side of the head is quite smaller than the other because I was critiquing it. And the Christ is looking at you, but it's not. Now maybe this is intentional, but you look at the pocket of the eye, there's not a symmetry there. One side of the eye is smaller than the other. And it's affecting how it's appearing. It appears to want to look at you, but it's not really looking at you. It's quite interesting. This is how I amuse myself.
At what point
Except when I'm at the New Masters Academy doing videos.
At what point do you kind of break away from the planar?
In 2 hours.
Okay. I know
Today?
we're probably not going to see it, so.
I break away from the planar. The planes help me read my work. It's used for accuracy. It's used for setting things up. It's used for seeing spaces. If I'm feeling comfortable that I've got my spaces worked out, because once again, like, so the tissue above the brow ridge, I don't even know its anatomical name, but, you know, I'll set it up quite deep as a plane while, you know, then pulling the superciliary arch out, this would need to come out. So I use planes to catch value. And because in order for it to do that, it needs to be hitting the light in a more extreme way than your model. So it's just something that helps you read your work. So it's the placement of shapes that, you know, you're looking at here. So when I feel comfortable with the placement of the shape, I start pulling my planes farther forward and then eventually start modeling them. But I've always found that it's an advantage. They teach drawing like this in Florence as well, straight lines. You know, it's always the organic curvature of all form, if it's the last thing you're adding onto your work, is easier. But if your geometric planar system is allowing you to see your work better, because the problem with clay, and I mentioned the darkness of it, and not everyone works with dark clay, but value's gone. Like, you don't see the value of the dark hair in the skin. You don't see blue eyes on this. You don't see eyebrow on here. So I think that just as you're setting something up, it's important to see it. Is it falling into the right spot? Do I have it right? Yes, that's why I said, I think in the beginning, my sculptures look a little bit alien because I'm really eliminating all organic from it. that's always, you know, the frosting on the cake, right? So I'm pretty patient to get there. But, you know, for me as well, I mean, just personally as a sculptor, you know, I can talk about sculpture as its relationship to education and things I would suggest. I can talk about sculpture as what it is for me. You know, sometimes they're two different things. But I like different things going on in my sculpture. I like different textures. I like to build up different things. I like some areas that are finished. I like some areas that are rough. I like maybe some sculptures that are all completely finished, like skin. I like to explore that. I like to think about possibilities. I think finish can help sort of, and I'll say this once again, we were talking about this earlier. I was a sculptor in a painting world, in a painter's world. And painters work with these phenomenal compositional techniques that aren't always available to a sculptor. And they made me jealous, like how to use light to create a focal point. Sculpture is something that often doesn't have a focal point. That doesn't mean it shouldn't have one. That doesn't mean as you make a sculpture, you don't want it to have one. I make sculptures and want people to look at certain things, and other things are boring. Look at the back of Michelangelo's David. He didn't love that like he liked the front of it. So I wanted to use textures in my work to try to define if something was more finished, would it attract more attention? And then I want them to look at that. Because sometimes in a sculpture, particularly portraiture, when you're making decisions about composition, the shoulder may not be important for you to look at, but it may be important for composition. So how to treat it, how to make it look like, yeah, it's there and it needs to be, and you're seeing it flow and move up into the head, but don't spend a lot of time looking at it because I actually want you to look here. So I was using all those textures. I found that I defeated like the purpose. I found that people were always way more interested in sketch, and those became the focal points of the work. That everyone's like, oh wow, look what's going on over here. And that was the area that was more sketchy, which meant for me, I thought, let's not dwell upon this. Let's get you moving, your eyes moving into another area. So this is something I've always explored, the idea of finish, non-finish, and that's a painterly thing, you know. So maybe I'm a painter at heart, I don't know. I know there'd be some people out there that would love to hear me say that, but I'm colorblind, actually. So I have noticed these fantastic sunsets here and sunrises in Southern California. Actually, can you turn just a little bit? Yeah. That I've even admired for their color, which for me is unique because I see color, but I definitely don't react to it like the painters that are good friends of mine. You go out for a beer with a painter, my God. They talk about skin hue and chroma and all this stuff that I'm just like, really? Anyway, guys, I got my wife's waiting for me at home. So anyway, I don't react to color. I don't look at it and go, wow. Except when I came here to Southern California. It's quite exciting, the sunsets here. I saw a lot of color in them. Now, someone gave me these glasses, and I was like, my life changed. No, I'm joking. But I see quite high, intense colors. So like really blue things and really yellow things, and I do see stoplights, and you don't have to be afraid on the road if I'm driving. But it's the hue, or I guess the chroma of the color, the intensity of the color when it gets really reduced, and everyone goes, Rob, why are you wearing purple pants? And you're like, purple? I thought they were green, or I thought they were ochre, or I thought they, you know, and a painter will go and, you know. A funny story is of Daniel Graves. I went to go move into the studio, a different studio, and I started painting some of the trim around a window. And I went to the store, and I told the guy at the store, I want to get a light gray. So he showed me this color thing. And he goes, what do you think of that one? I'm like, perfect. I painted my trimming with all this stuff, and Daniel Graves, the painter, comes in and he goes, "Rob, what is that?" I'm like, "What?" He goes, I said, "It's gray, don't you like it?" He goes, "No, it's all purple." I'd painted all this trim in my studio purple. Anyway, it's a funny story.
Rob, a question. Speaking of all your, speaking of your time with Daniel Graves and learning there and all that, what would you say is the value of sort of working on a drawing while also sculpting, having the training?
I think the value on the new Masters Academy video, you're going to hear me talk about the value of the optical impression for the sculptor. The drawing in space, principally putting it together is a constructive technique, construction. But I do find a big value in optical, the impression of your work, and I think it's something sculptors should pay more attention to, and that's what they're learning in the drawing room. So when you put a student in a drawing room and there's a model bathed in north light, and you say, "Okay, listen, we're going to talk about a lot of things, but do you see, okay, the goal is to make your drawing look like a model bathed in light. Do you see it? Yeah, I get it, I see that." And then you take a student into a sculpture room and you put that model there, and you don't talk about the light bathing the model because it's not constructive, and you go, "Do you see a narrative in front of you?" It's just a person standing in a position. It lacks narrative. So I think that there's a clear narrative that working on a drawing can help you, because narrative in sculpture, for me, the way I teach it, is very small. There's these very subtle things. A figure bathed in light's very obvious. But once a student gets used to the narrative and used to trying to achieve it, I'll take them into the sculpture room and then talk to them, "Well, the narrative I'm going to introduce you to is now this." And it's very subtle things, but I like to, it's about goals. I say it on the video. I have Johanna sitting here modeling for me. I'm not even looking at her anymore. What's the narrative of a sculpture while you're studying it? There's always limitations of what you can do with a model. You can't hire a model to come in and say, "Okay, listen, I'm going to do a narrative of a bowling alley, and you're going to hold a 25-pound bowling ball for the next 40 hours. They won't work for you. You have to pose them and say, "Are you comfortable? And is everything okay? You want a glass of water?" And the thing so they're just standing there. Their bodies, we're not thinking about light. So the problem, what is the narrative here? And that's something that I found so valuable, is their body standing in that pose for these very subtle differences became the narrative. What are you finding here that makes you convinced that their weight-bearing leg looks different than their balanced leg? You remember the 4 windows of the Contrapposto. Okay, so there's these very subtle differences, and this is where proportions become, to me, quite meaningful, speaking of proportions. When you look through the side plane of a model standing in Contrapposto, in 9 times out of 10, you're going to find that because it's the tense leg, that the gluteus muscle is pushing out along with the thigh. So when you look straight through the side of a model, through the balanced leg side, the width that you're seeing, this leg will be exposed visually. And you'll go, "Does this mean that one of her legs or his legs is bigger than the other?" And the answer is no. Because if they stood straight, there would probably be a balance in proportions existing. But when they went like that, the balanced leg relaxed, the stand leg got really active. There's these subtle proportional differences that, once again, speak of this is how this body becomes active. And this is these small little things. Actually, these are what I call the details of sculpture. I refer to them as the 4 windows of the Contrapposto, because in a Contrapposto they work in the extension compression, and then down into the thighs where you get tension and relaxation. So that's a lot of the study of aesthetic. But I think it's important that a student gets used to the narrative, because I think the narrative, at least that I like to deliver to people in sculpture, once again, is quite subtle, not nearly as obvious as a figure bathed in light. The other advantage a student has when they're learning how to draw is they're only dealing with one perspective of a model. So I try to work with people teaching drawing, because you know I didn't teach drawing there, unless you just counted my whole first few years of a student being in sculpture class and critiquing their work on the basis of it being inaccurately drawn. What was I saying? I'm trying to answer your question still. You're like, I forgot what I asked you. I'm sorry, Rob. That was.
About drawing and how it relates to sculpture. What's the value of drawing to sculpture?
Yeah. But well, I'm rambling here about it. But I was talking about the narrative of drawing. Let me talk about sculpture. How about that? Yeah. Let me talk about an eye. Everyone loves to learn how to make an eye, so I'm not going to have time here to make a portrait head. One of the things, and I once again mentioned this on the new Masters video, is setting up an eye. It's a big challenge. Now, I would always start my understanding of an eye through profile. Can you look down, please? And can your eyes look down a little bit? Yes. I always try to set up my eye initially as a depth by locating the angle of the outer upper lid. Now, once again, I'm trying to set this in relationship to my profile. So I do not want to put the eye too far forward. I do not want to take out spatial qualities and spatial movement in my sculpture. The other thing about its angle is the angle is referencing where they're looking. So this becomes a very important guideline for position. I mentioned one of the big complexities of sculpting is by the time you're putting an eye in the sculpture, it may be days after you started it, and then all of a sudden you've made an accurate eye, but it doesn't kind of make sense with the general position of the head itself. So once again, I know I'm going to try to fight, I'll fight many battles. I got not only one eye to put on a sculpture, I got two eyes to put on a sculpture, and I got to make them look like they're both looking at the same thing. So to me, there's a lot of work to do with an eye in a sculpture. Once again, I purposely place it deep to fight the battles, bringing it forward as I start to get more comfortable, that I got familiar with it. And when I come to the front, I've already talked a little bit about trying to designate the space off the profile of the tear duct and then where the lids meet. So as I was mentioning early, sculpting is a lot about defining the space to work within. In other words, if I found the inner and outer space of the eye, when I go look closer at an eyelid, and that's when it's hard to judge when you're close, I know what space I'm trying to contain my movements in. The most important angle, which is hard to sometimes see when your model has eyelashes, is then I ask people to conceive of the angle between where the tear duct is and where the lids meet. An axis relative to the position of your model's head.
So Rob, in the new Masters Academy course that you just recorded, how much into the portrait do you end up going?
I discuss the whole thing, and I was making a head about this big, and I was trying to make half of it. So I had a block in on one side, and I left the other, I tried to finish the other side. That's not what I'd normally do. It's too hard to sculpt that way. But I've got thoroughly through the discussion of portraiture on the video, but I was doing it once again in this very challenging situation. I think one of the hardest things to make is a good working head that's, you know, probably 2 or 3 fingers high. It's a big challenge. When you're doing you know, if I was teaching a portrait class, I wouldn't be asking the students to do little small 1/2, 1/3 scale heads as a way to learn. I was mentioning earlier that the easiest way to, working bigger is much easier than working smaller. Making life-size sculpture is a lot easier than making half-scale sculpture, but it's unfortunate you can't introduce a student to make life-size sculptures because they're going to be making so many errors, and that when you make problems on a life-size, there's a lot to move around. So it just would be unfair. So, you know, talking about determining what space you have to work in, I mean, even on a human life-size head, you've got, you know, the lips, the mouth is quite small. You break down these spaces, and that's what kind of point I'm not making, this idea of that my conditions that I worked towards were establishing the profile, and then eventually through the front of the face. And I found the depth of the face through having executed the profile. And then you keep breaking things down. I mean, eventually you got to get close to things and kind of look at how they're moving. You can't stand back from a sculpture, you know, 3 feet and make sense of this. So the other discipline, Gabrielle, to go back to your question about this idea of drawing, drawing is very helpful because you stand at a natural distance away from your model. You know, if you put an easel in the room and you said, okay, this is our setup, a student's generally not going to go, okay, that's great, and then they just go and pick up the easel and move it like right in front of the model. They usually go, okay, well, this is where I have to draw. And, you know, the model's, you know, 10 feet away, and they're like going, oh, okay, well, I see these big lines and all this harmony. And sculptors are always like this. You know, well, if I'm going to be working, it's because I'm going to be touching my work. Now, I've also said this, the work you do as a sculptor is being done in this discussion that you're having at a distance from your work. All my work in sculpting is occurring here. This to me is just an execution of thought, or what I need to do, or what I can't see, or what needs to change. So touching sculpture for me is not really that much of a thing. It's really what is occurring before that. So I find that you learn a discipline in drawing that is kind of innate to the activity. Whereas clay and sculpture setup, and there's so many different ways to do things that, you know, there'll be sculptors listening to this video going, oh, this all sounds like a crock of shit. Can I say that?
I just did.
Okay. That, you know, you walk into model rooms and there's like, you know, 18, 25 students in a circle around a live model. I wouldn't put people in that situation. It's a little, I mean, I understand too that the conditions that I set up in my own studio or that we set up in Florence was this privileged thing because you can't get that many people around a model when you're working with a planar system. So that just is kind of obsoleted like right away by most people. And so I get it, you know, and it's, that's what I'm doing in Athens. I've set up a privileged situation for people to study in, you know, and it's, you know, there's a lot you learn. Most of the concepts that I teach about, also once again about the quote unquote details, narrative qualities that are aesthetically needing to be sought out in the human body, it doesn't make sense without a planar system. Because as I mentioned earlier, this concept of looking through the side of a model's pelvis or I keep saying her or his, and seeing that the stand leg, buttock and glute and quadriceps are wider than the other leg is done because you're looking through the side. When you go over here, none of that makes sense anymore. When you're using a center line to gather information from, like I'm doing here from here, I don't have a center line from here, 3/4. I mean, it's there in some parts, but I can't use it to organize with. So the principles that I teach about, and which include the inevitable goals of sculpting, of, you know, the quality of your work, don't work outside the system that I've worked in all these years. So I enjoy developing a studio. Well, I enjoy having a studio that I can set up a position of privilege to study in.
So just letting everybody know we're a little over on the time. Does anybody have any sort of last questions for Rob?
Why didn't I finish this sculpture?
Could you talk a little bit about how you capture movement in your sculptures?
Yes, I can. The reason that I learned that trying to make a sculpture of a model standing in pose was irrelevant was out of a need for me to make a sculpture. The marionettes I made multiple of them. I made a Petrushka, who was a marionette. I made La Marionetta. I made Broke Down Palace. These are all marionettes. If you're thinking about that, because you could be thinking about other things, but these aren't models that can stand in positions. And so I needed to evolve drawing in space at this point to allow me to study from life, because I wanted them to appear natural, not some sort of generalized, generic human being. And what I started to do was understand that the box and egg, which is the concept of what's underlying the human body, which is also what we use to observe on this parallel system from, that when I'm working on those sculptures, I mean, that sculpture's composed before I start making it. Not all my sculptures are doing that, but the movement that's in that sculpture is defined by, I want to turn the rib cage this way, I want to turn the pelvis this way. You have an idea of how the underlying body is going to capture these movements. Then I observe the model going, you know, hold your rib cage like this, and I'll start to set up contour edges and shapes on the rib cage. And then I'll have them hold the leg like this and study the leg that's resting in the other leg. So I work piecemeal by connecting this internal connection and then observing every element of the human body and taking away foreshortening from it. The reason my sculptures have movement is because I really appreciate movement. In the new Masters video, there could have been a lot that had gone wrong. In other words, the only problem with this video, if there is one, is I didn't take a lot of clay off. And when I'm working in my studio, I was like, didn't work, cut it off. But so I was being kind of careful. And I set up things, and the conditions of drawing in space means that you're establishing a length between the height of the pelvis and the bottom of the feet, and that never's wrong. It's the first thing you do. So you have a length in your sculpture that's never called into question, so this is a way to control proportions. The only thing then you have to do to that situation is put width into it. So your width may be wrong. It could be too wide, and then if you use it to draw contours, then your legs are going to look short. And you'd have to thin it out. And my recommendation is to start a little bit small, evolve your contours, and then kind of start pulling things out when your leg doesn't taper anymore. So proportions are actually considered through tapering, because something tapers in a length, right? And so you say, how many ankles fit through the thigh? And you go, well, I only have 2, and there should be 3. And I say, well, okay, do you pull out the widths of your thigh, or do you reduce your ankle width? Because that's the only thing available to you. So the questions become, this is how I ask my students to think, that they go, well, I definitely can't reduce the ankle, so I guess my pelvis needs to widen and my thighs need to widen. I go, you're right. It's like a big puzzle. But what ends up occurring is when I'm drawing these contours from my pelvis to my ankle, so there's a lot of contours in the leg, I'm exploring everything through movement of contour. So I love movement and I love contours. And so what I'm doing is I'm drawing these contours up and down each of these legs from pelvic point to ankle. And I just kept focusing on the movement. Do I have the movement? No, it's the line isn't gestural enough. There's stronger gestures and movements on my model. And I keep pushing it to be stronger and stronger and stronger. And in the situation of the video, they just kind of wound up. Now there's probably proportional discrepancies between the model and that, but I didn't have to ever take much off. All I did was push movement in my work. And that's really what I want the work to be. So if it's out of proportion a little bit, I don't care. If it doesn't move, I do. So I'm always approaching everything through conditions of movement. The primary aesthetic that I pursue. Does it move enough? Because there's large gestures, there's small gestures. I mean, you know, you can break down gesture everywhere. You can look at an ankle and the way contour edges run into an ankle bony point, and you can see gesture. And you can go and look at yours and go, well, do you have that gesture? Well, you got to add or subtract to your sculpture if you don't. So if you I keep, once again, exploring through gesture. And every time you don't have it, once again, you have a proportional thing to also solve. Do I have room to add my gesture, or do I have to subtract my gesture? Good question, though. Anyway. So it's a Giacometti.
Well, last question that I have, at least, is something that we discussed when I was finishing up my last sculpture with you, is the title of a piece. And I told you how much I hated doing that, how much I didn't like naming stuff. And you said, well, what you have is, with a title, you have at least like a sentence or less to inform an uninformed audience. Yes. That's something that's really stuck with me.
I didn't come up with that. I won't take credit for that. John Spike, art historian, told me that.
My question to you is, when you think of the narrative, you talk about the narrative stuff, the pieces that I love of yours are carotid and feline, because you added the base of the sculpture you incorporated into as part of the sculpture. So yeah. How do you compose your sculptures before you start? How do you do that?
I don't have a way, to be honest with you. I mean, it's probably why I don't make as many sculptures as I physically could, is because my work is created, they're all musings about my life. And I think that I've realized something also here in just discussing with people certain things, but I'm connected to my work because it is about something that has occurred in my life, or it's not some concept of, you know, I want to make a sculpture based upon some concept. I find injustice out there and I'm going to make a sculpture on it. But I've never been part of that injustice. I just think it's wrong. So, you know, you make this, my work isn't a comment about something. It's more about me, but it's not important. Being about me in my experience allows me to kind of feel it while I'm making it, because I felt these experiences. So feline is a really base, it's a requiem for my cat. It doesn't mean anything to the sculpture, but it helped me connect with my work. Instead of, I don't like there to be this layer between my work and me. There would be, my worst sculptures I ever made when I was trying to make narrative sculpture, like Wife of Lot. You know, it was a sculpture that looked like that. And I was trying to make the Wife of Lot. I mean, I don't know why. I do know why, but anyway, I didn't connect with it. There was this layer, there was a narrative there I was trying to explain in a sculpture. So there was a connection I didn't have with it. But the bases are becoming more and more a part of my work, and I'm wanting to make them as human as my sculptures. And my recent sculpture is a new caryatid, and I just haven't had no time to work on it. But my new sculpture for me is, because I'm just so interested in the theme of the caryatid. But it's going to be about 2.5 meters tall. But the figure in it's about this tall. And then everything else above it and below it now is the base. And I'm doing a couple of things differently. I'm not studying, I've already hired a model and I've already done the study for this very small element in the sculpture. And instead of sculpting from life, which I had now finished, I'm gonna use the plaster. Because I find I get into trouble when I'm working in front of life. I keep going, oh, this doesn't work, oh, this doesn't work. I'm critiquing like I critique students myself, and I just keep moving stuff around instead of going, is this right for the sculpture? So the model's in front of you for a reference. And so I want to work with a reference that doesn't move, that I've already studied its movement, and then try to see how I can incorporate the figure into the sculpture without it being just this me moving stuff around all the time. But anyway, I want to make the bottom and top of the sculpture very human, as human as a figure in this, and it will be a challenge for me. So I'm looking, these compositional elements are crucial to me. Anything that touches your sculpture becomes part of your sculpture, whether it's the plinth in a gallery, whether it's a base that you have on it. It's a really important conception. Like if you take to heart this idea of, because the reason I was talking to an art historian, I told him, like, listen, I don't really think that there's this big importance in titling your work. And he goes, don't undermine it, because you have this very small opportunity to help a viewer understand. It's your only chance when they don't get your work. So anyway.
Well, on that note, Rob, I really appreciate you coming here and helping us understand how you work. We're really excited to see this Drawing in Space video series come to New Masters. We'd love to have you back in the future. And thank you so much for doing this free demo for everybody. I really appreciate it. Thanks. Thanks, guys.
It's a great model. I want to work more. Everyone go away. I want to sculpt. Thank you. And thank you all. It's been a pleasure. You guys are great question askers. If that's a thing. Can you say that? Anyway. I'm sorry. I wasn't really focused on making your head somehow. I would have liked to have.
I'm distracted. We do the profile and the width, and then all of a sudden it starts to connect and raise.
Yeah.
Like that's a magic moment when it starts to. That's cool.
I mean, I was looking at there going, I know I need to do this. I know I need to do that. There are a lot of things up here that. The other thing that I didn't say, I'll just talk to you about this drawing. The way in which I work here about these contours and this drawing, it's like the setup. This allows me to not have to rely on my models. So I just do this when the model's there in the studio, and then I'll model the forms when they leave. So I'll work with the model for a couple of hours, very focused, and like get things set up as best I can. And when I start to go, okay, that kind of is locked in, that looks like it's in a good space, that looks like it reads well, I finish my sculptures without a model. So these techniques, once again, I call them shorthand techniques of drawing where where shadow and light is, and then using the contour edges to describe the external contours. It's all shorthand of like, it's not form. You know, it's referencing form and spaces. But once again, when you lock them in, you start to get, you can start working with models. So I'll do a 2-hour model session, then I'll work 6 hours on my sculpture. So it just helps propel me. I teach the poor man's version or women's of sculpture. Like, do it, be able to do it with a candle, and not have to rely on your models all the time. This looks like the sculpture I made of the demo, the female. No wonder someone came in and looked at the demo sculpture and was like, that looks like Johanna. And now I've made a sculpture that looks like the demo. Over these past 20 years, the curriculum at the Florence Academy of Art has evolved under my direction. One of my main goals throughout this course is to be able to give you the vocabulary and the mindset that I was instilling into students at the Florence Academy of Art. The first section that I'm going to introduce to you is going to be the concept of using the box and egg, which will reference the pelvis and the rib cage and the connection of the spinal column. The second section of drawing in space is about the rendering of the figure, how to introduce external contours, how to find and locate internal shapes of shadow and light that you're seeing on the figure. The last section of drawing in space is modeling.